Well,
All
this
right.
talk is called Mizpah, the Man in the Water, and it's a ship. It's a discussion of a ship portrait from the Yarmouth County Museum in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia. This is a painting of the Mizpah, but it's not the painting that I'm going to be talking about. But I just wanted to put a ship painting on the screen to mention that the fact that the Yarmouth County Museum has the third largest collection of ship portraits in Canada, after the New Brunswick Museum and the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic, both provincial museums. That's not bad for a small town museum. Now, why do we have such a large collection? Well, in 1878, 1879, Yarmouth was the second largest port of registry in Canada, behind St. John, New Brunswick. Doesn't mean we had more ships in the other ports, but what it means, we had more total tonnage or carrying capacity than any other port except St. John, New Brunswick. So that's impressive, I think. And as I said, that's why we have such a good ship portrait collection. And it's growing all the time. We just managed to acquire another ship portrait just last week. Very nice one. A storm scene, actually. So this painting was done by a man named Fred Wettering in 1875, and he was from Bremen, Germany. And I like this painting because this island in the background is called Heligoland, and it's an island in the estuary of the river Elbe, just up from Hamburg, Germany. And I sailed a transatlantic race once on a small 60-foot yawl, and that boat was called the Pickle, but its original name was Heligoland, so named after this island here. So I like this painting. These are the details of the Mizpah, and the Yarmouth Herald of September the 11th, 1873 tells us that on the 5th was launched at Salmon River, Digby County, the fine barque Mizpah, 898 tons register, built under the superintendence of Mr. Jacob Allen and owned by Messrs. N.B. Lewis, H. Lewis, Hugh Can, Hugh E. Can, and Captain F.J. Cook, who is to command her. She is classed 8 years at French Veritas and American Lloyd's. The Mizpah was towed by steamer G.W. Johnson to this port, Yarmouth, where she is being rigged. She will be ready for sea in a few days. These are the owners of the Mizpah: Nathan B. Lewis, 14 shares, Henry Lewis, 14 shares, Hugh Can, 16 shares, Hugh E. Can, 12 shares, and Francis G. Cook, 8 shares, for a total of 64 shares. Now, this was the way that the British managed the ownership of ships, and Yarmouth, being part of the Dominion of Canada, which came under the British. Well, it wasn't the Commonwealth at the time, but we followed the British rules. And so 64 shares. Why 64? Well, if you have something, you split it in half, you get 2s. If you split it in half again, you get 4, half again, 18, then 16, 32, and 64. So a person could own 1 share and somebody else could own the rest of the 63. A person might own all 64 shares, or as in the case of the Mizpah, it could be divided up by a number of shareholders. Now, if you look at the Yarmouth register, you can see who owned all the shares, what their primary jobs were, and when they bought the shares and when they sold the shares. And in this case, there were only 3 share transactions made. Both of the Lewises sold 2 shares to Captain George E. Can when he took command of the ship in 1874. And then Henry Lewis sold 4 shares to Captain Mitchell Dowley in 1880 for the same reason. Why would you want the captain to have shares? Well, if the captain was the man on hand, he was in charge of the ship, and he would look after the ship and look after the business dealings. And so if he was making a bit of money on it, he would certainly ensure that the best was going to happen for the ship. So it made a lot of sense for the captains to have shares in the vessel. This is a book written by Esther Lewis Kroll, whose grandfather was Captain Henry Lewis, one of the owners. And in this book, she wrote about the filing system for the ships. And she said, when the Century was young and I was perhaps 6 years old, I remember going into what was called the lower store at the head of my grandfather's wharf on Water Street here in Yarmouth. There, Mr. Ellenwood, the old bookkeeper, sat perched on his high stool. Halfway up the paneled walls of the room were shelves, on which were perhaps 20 little oaken boxes, on the front of which were printed in black and gold lettering the names of ships: the Mizpah, Republic, Equator, Euphemia, Otago, Harry Lewis, N.B. Lewis, Ben Bolt, Georgiana, and others that I cannot recall. Now, I remember this lady. She was a member of our society when I first came to Yarmouth. Now, during the first few years, the Mizpah was confined to the North Atlantic trades, mainly carrying oil or grain from the American ports of Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York, or cotton from the southern US ports, timber from Quebec. All these went to a variety of European ports, with probably Irish ports in the predominance. If not in ballast, which is just no cargo, but rocks or something to make the ship stable. If not in ballast, the return cargoes varied, but more often included pig iron from the ports of the Scottish Clyde estuary. And only, in fact, once in the ship's lifetime did the Mizpah venture out of the North Atlantic basin, when in 1885 she went to the Mediterranean port of Genoa. So these are the Mizpah's captains. And in this this presentation, I'm only going to deal with Captain Mitchell Dowley, who had command twice, January 1880 to September 1881, and then later on in 1886 and 87. Now, it was the first of these commands, when Captain Dowley first had command, that this situation occurred. And this is the painting that I'm going to be speaking of. The Mizpah sailed with Captain Dowley as master on February the 18th, 1880, from Baltimore for Waterford, Ireland. And while there are no charter parties in existence, that's the paper which tells what the cargo was, what the rates were, and so on, I suspect that it was a cargo of grain going from Baltimore to Waterford. Following Waterford, the ship went to Troon and Ardrossan in the Clyde estuary in Scotland, and then she loaded pig iron for Providence, Rhode Island. So this is the details of the painting, the catalog number, so on, length, dimensions, caption, how we acquired it from May Dowley, who was, I believe, a granddaughter of Captain Dowley. And we know that it was passed down from Captain Dowley through his family until the museum acquired it. In a lot of European churches, you see what's called votive models. And these are models which hang in the churches, and they're called votive models because the ship had been in a storm and had been saved. And so what they were doing in the churches were making a model to thank God for preserving the ship and the crew. And I think that this painting could almost be called a votive painting, since the vessel and the crew survived the storm. Word Mizpah comes from the, I think, Hebrew phrase, "May the Lord watch between me and thee when we are absent one from another." And we might wish to believe that there was a connection with the ship's name and this storm. Now we see along the bottom left of the painting, the caption, and the caption reads, "Barque Mizpah in a hurricane, February the 13th, 1880, latitude 4834, longitude 3915, Captain M. Dowley. And it basically is a brief summary of what's going on. And then if you look in the right-hand corner, you can see, not very well, but you can see that it's signed H. Peterson and P.C. Holm, 1882. And this is so difficult to read that when I became the curator of the museum in 1974, I was told that this painting didn't have a signature, and I believed that because I couldn't see a signature. And then once we'd built our addition, I moved the painting into the hallway, and I was walking past it one day, and the sun just happened to be on the painting, or the light happened to be on the painting in a certain way, and I thought, oh my goodness, there's a signature. Sure enough, P.C. Holm, H. Peterson and P.C. Holm, 1882. I have to flip back to this, and we see these two dates. February the 13th, 1880 is the date in the caption, but we know that that from the Yarmouth papers, the ship didn't leave Baltimore till February the 13th. So that's wrong. And of course, I also wonder if the latitude and longitude are right, but I suspect they're probably correct. Now, if a ship had been in a situation like this and the captain wanted a painting done of it, he would have normally, under normal circumstances, he would have asked an artist in the port of destination to paint the picture while it was still fresh in his mind. However, Westport or West Waterford being a relatively small port, there were not likely any ship portrait artists there. So it was done in 1882. However, H. Peterson and P.C. Holm practiced their art in a place called Altona, Germany, which is a suburb of Hamburg. Now, the Mizpah, according to the records, and of course I believe these, the Mizpah was not in Hamburg in 1882. Strange thing. However, after Dowley left the Mizpah, he took command of a ship called the Magnolia, and while master of her, he arrived in Hamburg on July the 18th, 1882, and left in August of the same year. So that would have given him lots of time to go and find an artist who he respected and have this painting done for him. So it's a very unusual painting. And I was told when I first came to the museum that this painting scares children. So a few years ago, 2013, this painting appeared in the Bonham, New York Maritime sale, and I noticed in the catalog, and it was described as being Chinese, and I wondered if this Chinese portrait may have shown some or had some influence on the work of Peterson and Holm. By the way, Peterson was the nephew of Holm. Holm was Peterson's father's brother. Now, this painting could have influenced the Chinese. Not likely, though. This painting was done by Lorenz Peterson in 1857 and is a portrait of the barque Dido at anchor off Keelung, Formosa. And it was done by H. Peterson's father. And you can see the colors of the sky, the colors of the water, the colors of the cloud, even of the vessel, are very similar to those in our painting, the one that we're discussing. And you can see this faint lightning bolt coming from this light cloud in the sky. Remember that. I also came across this painting, and this was done by Thomas Goldsworth Dutton, and there was a print of it made in 1848. Now, either the print or the original painting are in the Royal Museum at Greenwich. So I'm not convinced that the Bonham's painting was in fact Chinese. Could have been, but so here's our painting again, and you look at this bright patch in the sky, and here, very faintly, is a bolt of lightning. So you have the sun following the father's details. Also, you can see right here, there's a bit of what looks like snow. You can see it a little better in this one. So the painting was done to show there was a snow squall. The snow doesn't extend over the whole canvas, just this part around the canvas. So it's intentional, because I've seen more than one painting which is speckled with snow, but speckled by a clumsy ceiling painter with a roller. And I've seen that in more than one cases. And the clue to this is when the frame has snow on it. This one doesn't, so it's purposely put there. So let's have a look at the details. And I should say that this painting, it's a large painting, but the vessel in the painting is relatively small. So you can't see the details easily unless you've taken a photograph of it, you put the photo on the camera and you can blow it up, put the photo on the computer and you can blow it up and see loads and loads of details, which I did here. In fact, I saw another detail just today, which I'll come to later. So what's happening in this situation is, and it makes you wonder whether this wave in the background was really that high. Could have been. I'm not so sure. But in this painting, the Mizpah is what's called lying to, Lying-to. That is, it's attempting to make headway, but instead just letting the sea carry it and the wind carry the ship in the safest condition. And what they do to get into that position is to put a sail up here and goose wing this sail and this sail, or perhaps set them and turn that yard around so it goes a little more this way. So that will end up, the wind is coming from this way, that will end up putting the ship in this situation with the wind and the seas coming this way. So it won't come sideways on and it won't come straight on. The waves will be coming onto this part of the ship. But when you have a look at the close-ups, you can see that this sail has burst and it's blown out of its bolt ropes. And I think this thing, which I just noticed today, might be a replacement for that sail. I can't think of anything else for it. You can see that the two topsails are up and blowing over the yard, so they're not doing a lot of good. You can see a few more things here. You can see three guys, one here, and one here, and they're climbing up. This is the mainstay or a main support for this mast. Well, they don't do that. You don't climb up the mainstay or down the mainstay. What you do if you're trying to get into the rigging, you climb up these things, which are called ratlins, and they're made to climb up. But you would never climb up this one, the leeward wing ratlins. You'd always climb up this one, which is the windward ratlins. That way, if the wind is blowing, the wind will blow the sailor onto the ratlins. Whereas if he's climbing these, it might blow him off into the water. So perhaps you couldn't get to these ratlins. Maybe they'd been damaged by the water. Maybe they were trying to get out of the water. I just not sure. This was a real predicament. And this led me to investigate the painting even more. You can see that these are ship's boats, one here, one here. Normally they're secured this way, so that if they need to get them, this boat can go over that rail, this one can come over this rail. But this one has been, pardon me, this one has been blown and is all askew. That tells me that there's been a lot of water on the deck, because the wind can't do that. It's just, it would have been a lot of water on the deck. So there's a lot of details, as I said. We can also see that there's two men on this yard. These are the yards, and the sails are attached to the yard. And I thought, well, why are these guys up on the yard? Maybe the sail has started to come loose and they've gone up to secure it. Who knows? We can also see this is the poop deck. Here, this is the steering wheel, and there's two men on the poop attached to the wheel or steering the ship, probably tied down. You can also see the man in the water. Here's the guy in the water. Here's another man on deck, possibly the mate or the captain, throwing a line to the man in the water. Now, who is that guy? That's really what I want to know. There's a lot of questions to be asked. How do we find out about all this? Well, there's reports in the papers, sometimes not very good, and I'd scanned the papers. The Yarmouth papers hadn't come across anything, but what they have are called crew lists, or the agreement and account of crew. And after every voyage, now a voyage was a round trip, generally from a European port to somewhere across the Atlantic, maybe even around the world, and then at the end of 3 years, end up back in a European port. And that's what all of this stuff basically says. It's the crew list started in Antwerp on the 1st of April, 1880, and it's signed by Mitchell Dowley, the captain. But what's useful is that the crew signed on, and what it tells is the name of the crew, when he was born or how old he is, where the crew was from, which ship he was on previously, what the date is, what his capacity was. This guy was, for example, was a cook. This was an able seaman. And then continued on the next page what their wages were. Most of the sailors got £3 a month. This would, at £8, that would be the mate. And then where they left the ship, how they left the ship, and so on. Now, in our case, it starts down here, where this was, this fella here, he was from Scotland, and he was an able seaman. He got £4.20 a month, and he left in Waterford. So this is the crew for this particular voyage. The mate was 32. He was from Boston. The bosun, who's sort of the guy in charge of the crew, but not an officer, he was from Norway. And then these are all able seamen, one ordinary seaman and one boy. There's nobody listed as cook, so I suspect they made the boy the cook. One of them, this fella, deserted. Wilson, he deserted when the ship got to Waterford, and here it says deserted. So we can learn a lot from this sort of thing. Now, most of these guys signed back on for the next voyage. So they signed back on in Waterford, and that tells me that these were professional seamen, and they were used to rough weather. They took it in stride, and even though they'd been through this major storm, it was part of their duties, and they signed back on. So we happen to have a second-hand account of the situation, and this comes in the form of a handwritten letter by one of Captain Dowley's daughters. And here it is, typed out because the writing is difficult. And it says, Edna, I may not have been born when this happened. What I know, Mother told me a few years before she died. I suppose it was bound to England and Liverpool. Date, I believe, in the bottom of the picture frame. I think coming around Cape Horn. I think mother had her eldest daughter with her somewhere in her teens. Mother was making coffee for the sailors. Annie was in her stateroom. The sailors lashed in the rigging. The captain had only his mate to help him. Annie came out of her room and said, "Mother, we are not going to be lost tonight." Mother went to see where father was, and as he ran by the entrance, he called loudly for her to go down in the cabin and stay there as a plank fell down across the door. As the ship rolled away, mother held the coffee pot in her hand. The other hand held her against the door. When the ship rolled back, she clapped, in her own words, the coffee pot on the stove to keep it hot for the sailors. It was a cold night. How they reached shore, I can't say. Mother was about 35 years, and I should think, and had other children, but if they were boarded with relatives. Annie was her first child. Mother was married at 17, and Annie was born when she was 20. This is all I can do, for I didn't ask mother any questions which I should have. I wasn't interested then as of now. You have the name and place on the frame of the picture, unless it is broken off. Father's name as well. Lovingly, May. What this says is May had a lot of details wrong here. They weren't going around Cape Horn, and they weren't bound for Liverpool, but she didn't know. She did her best. This is Captain Dowley's wife, Mary Hannah Dowley, and she was born in Beaver River, Yarmouth County, died at Smith's Cove, Digby County, and was buried in the Port Maitland Cemetery. This is Anne Dowley, the daughter, and she too was buried in the cemetery. And this is Annie's grave marker in the cemetery. I mentioned the fact that Esther Clark Lewis had written an account and had talked about the boxes where all the information on the various ships were kept. This, I think, was the label from the box for the Mizpah. And I gave a talk about both of our ship portraits at a historical society meeting once, and just by chance, Esther Clark Wright's granddaughter was in the audience. She lives in Florida, so that was quite unusual. But she came to see me afterwards and said, "I have the insurance papers from that particular voyage, and I'll lend them to you if you'd like." So she loaned them to me, and here they are. They were written up by a Yarmouth firm, Thomas Bingy and Company, and they tell loads and loads of details about this particular voyage, cost to repairs, how much cost the Mizpah, how much it cost the insurance company, and so on. And this is quite a long document, but these three items show the steam tug profit, because in Waterford, while they were unloading the cargo, the ship actually ran aground, and the steam tug Powerful was had to pull her off at the cost of £25. Before it was pulled off, a survey was taken to ensure that she was seaworthy, and that cost £2, 2 shilling. And this is noting the protest, 8 shilling. And the protest was what the captain had made, and he would go to a lawyer or a notary public and state that the damage to the ship was not his fault, it was the fault of the weather. And that's a relatively common thing to do. This shows some of the disbursements in Troon once the ship had got to Scotland, and it shows a lot of things in detail. Cash paid cab taking sick seamen to the railway station. These are items for the ship. Some may be for the repairs, some may be just for the ship itself. This is chandlery or items required by the ship. And here we have 2 pounds of candles. Well, that wasn't for repairs, so that would be charged to the ship. This is the details that the protest resulted in, making copies of it, preparing it, sending it to various places, and so on. So the whole protest situation cost £5, 2 shillings and 4p. And then this is the final summary page, where it was decided that this 5,311 shillings and pardon me, this is in dollars, so it had been converted. $5,311.24. And it was decided by the various people in the know that 3,000 of that would be paid, the new net particular average, that would be the insurance company's share, and the cost to the ship was $23.80 So there we have a very significant document which helped a lot. We're going to skip that part. We'll come back to that painting and that voyage, but I want to go next to the second time that Captain Dowley had taken command. And in this situation, he took a load of crude oil from Philadelphia to a place called Barque in Germany, went back to load another cargo of oil, this time for Dunkirk. And this is a map showing England up at the top, France down here. Here's Dunkirk, where the ship had delivered her cargo of oil. She'd taken on a very small cargo to return to Philadelphia, but the crew actually, let me see, from the, there was a note in the Yarmouth Herald on the 8th of December, 1886, to say, London, November 30th, Barque Mizpah Dowley, which sailed from Dunkirk, November 29th for Philadelphia, has anchored at Deal, which is right here, and the captain has landed, the crew having struck. So he had problems with the crew. He landed there. Very likely someone came and sorted out the crew, and he set sail again. And I'll read what happened then, but it was a major storm, and he ended up putting back into this place called Falmouth in England. On January the 5th, 1887, the edition of the Yarmouth Herald had a letter from Captain Dowley, and it explained the situation. And here's the letter, and I'll read bits and pieces of it. Stormy weather encountered by Barque Mizpah. Letter from Captain Dowley, Falmouth, England, December the 16th, 1886. Sir, Barque Mizpah sailed from Dunkirk November 29th with a cargo of 500 tons phosphate, 3,676 empty petroleum drums, and 615 barrels colson oil. Although all through the 24 hours of the 8th, the gale blew frightfully, whistling as it passed along, nearly as loud as a steamer's whistle, and the high cross seas was something fearful to look at. During the afternoon, I stood lashed to the mizzen rigging, expecting every moment to see a monster wave come on board and sweep everything away, and fearing by her terrible lurches to leeward that the main mast would go by the board. I looked at her with pity, seeing her struggle and trying to recover herself and come up again and battle with this terrible cross sea that seemed determined to destroy her. On the 10th, the wind came from the southwest and increased to a heavy gale, ship then making 6 inches water hourly. So, after duly considering all things, viz., the state of the ship, the nature of cargo, and the season of the year, concluded that it was unsafe for me to continue my voyage and deemed it best for the safety of the ship, cargo, and our own lives to bear up for Falmouth, which was done accordingly. Having been at sea nearly 40 years, but never experienced such a terrible storm and waves before, neither did I ever see any ship crawl over such cross seas as this noble craft did. M. Dowley, Barque Mizpah. There were two other ships in Falmouth for repairs as a result of this gigantic wave. The Cashier of Windsor, Nova Scotia, and the Stamboul, Captain Can from Yarmouth. As well, there was a Norwegian ship which also had to put back leaky. The Captain Dowley had to pay $1,600 for the repairs here, and has one of the owners, Nathan Lewis, wrote in a letter to one of his other captains, Captain Gullison of the NB Lewis, Captain Dowley had a bill $1,600 at Falmouth, more than she, the Mizpah, was worth. Well, after completing her repairs, she set off again. And there was another letter in the paper. More damage had occurred. And this is a summary from the Yarmouth Herald of the 20th of April, 1887. And I'll read it, bits and pieces again. Tempestuous weather at sea. Report of Captain Dowley, Barque Mizpah, from the Falmouth for Philadelphia. February the 25th, with a heavy sea running from the south. At 9:30, it blew a complete hurricane, and the wind was something fearful to look at. At 10, the foretopsail gave way and blew to pieces. This was a number 1 cotton sail, and had only run one passage. The sea now became so dangerous that I got a large bag of oil over each quarter. At 11:30, a mountain wave rolled over the stern, smashing the wheel to pieces and doing much other damage. Ship commenced broaching to. I got partway up the mizzen rigging and directed the steering by motion of my hand, for good steering and oil were now our only salvation. As far as the eye could reach astern, it looked like one solid white foam 50 feet high, apparently. By the ship's reports since my arrival in Philadelphia, this cyclone reached over 1,000 miles in all directions. Now, these two reports were not the reports of the painting. These were several years later. So within a month, the ship was ready to sail again, and she sailed under Captain Dowley from Philadelphia up through the. She was to go up to Quebec with a load of coal, and then she was to proceed down to Montreal, where she'd been chartered to carry wood to Buenos Aires. However, here we have a report from the paper, the loss of the Barque Mizpah. Captain Dowley sailed on the 6th with a cargo of hard coal and went ashore at Simon's Point head of Garibus Bay, Cape Breton. Crew landed. The ship is a total wreck. Says who the owners were, and there is very little insurance. So the owner could not have been particularly pleased. This shows where she went ashore up here. Here's Yarmouth. Here's the other end of Nova Scotia. And here's Garibus Bay. And here's a chart of the bay. So she went ashore somewhere in here and broke up and was lost. The Mizpah had survived 66 crossings in her life of nearly 14 years. And all Nathan B. Lewis could say in a letter to Captain Gullison, Dowley has wound up the Mizpah on Cape Breton about a total loss, no insurance of any account. Think he will do better hauling kelp and raising potatoes from this out. And I thought that's pretty harsh words for a captain who'd served him fairly well for those years. And he saved the ship from destruction from 2 previous passages. Dowley did actually leave the sea and died in 1899 in Brooklyn. And this is his death notice. And by the way, the sessional papers of the Parliament of the Dominion of Canada indicate the main cause for that storm was fog and currents, which caused the Mizpah to run ashore. Navigation by the captain was important, but the Dominion papers and the government felt that fog and currents were the main reason for the loss. So here's where Mitchell Dowley is buried, and incidentally, right next to Captain Gullison, the man who'd got these nasty letters from the ship's owner. But we still don't know who the man in the water is. If Captain Dowley had written those 2 long descriptive letters of his last 2 storms, I thought surely he would have written a letter about this storm. But I'd covered the papers, the Yarmouth papers, and I thought, well, where else might he have written? Well, the Dalhousie University, in their library, they have microfilm copies of the New York Maritime Register. And so I thought, I've got to check the New York Maritime Register out. So I drove 200 miles to check to see if there was a copy, anything in the New York Maritime Register written by Captain Dowley. And sure enough, going through all this awful microfilm, here is the account. Now I know you can't read that, so I'll read it for you. Mizpah, British, Dowley, from Baltimore at Waterford, reported that during heavy weather, ship laboring heavily and shipped large quantities of water, staving in forecastle and storeroom doors, washing off skylights and flooding cabin. On March the 13th, at 3:25 p.m., a terrific squall came from the west, the gale from the south never ceasing until the squall was upon us without any warning whatever. The helm was at once hove up and the after yards braced, but the forestaysail blowing out of the bolt ropes, and she flew up into the wind heading south-southwest, thus bringing the southeast sea on her lee side, filling the decks full to the top of the forward house, rolling the chain out of the locker and pressing her down on beam ends, shifting all the bag cargo, washing seamen's chests and bedding out of the forecastle, all the provisions in use out of the storeroom, washing down the bulkheads and washing everything out of the galley, cook included. The mate was washed overboard, but was finally saved, and one man had his leg broken. The ship lying in this position about 1 hour, the hurricane blowing from the southwest and heavy sea rolling into leeward, she lay helpless and nearly motionless. Only when a huge wave would roll over her bow, she would plunge down as though she were making her last dive. As soon as could be done, the weather clue of the reef foresail was set. When she gradually paid off to sea, in which position we kept her as well as we could under the heavy sea, got run down a little, being afraid to keep her on the trough of the sea, as she certainly would have rolled over and foundered. At 7 p.m., ran before the wind, blowing a hurricane, excuse me, ship going alongside on her broadside, the sea running high and cross, rolling on board over both sides and filling her decks to the rails. At 7:30, put all hands on both pumps. At 10, the lead pump gave out. It was found that one plug in wake of waterport had rocked out, and the ship had been filling through the hole for several hours. It was replaced by another one at once. At 10 a.m., got rolling suck on the weather pump. At 3:30 of the 14th, brought the ship to the wind on the port tack, and after 3 hours, hard pumping got her free. We then turned over a little bag cargo and proceeded on our way. The Waterford, after discharging cargo and while lying opposite Waterford, dragged anchor April the 19th during the gale and grounded. So there we have it. We know that the date on the painting should have been March the 13th. We know why the men were on the foreyard right here. They were about to reset the sail. Now I should say that the timeline in this painting covers various things. It's not all instantaneous. These guys weren't on the yard at the same time as these guys were climbing up the rigging. So we know why the men were there. They were to sail. We know why these three men were climbing up there. They were getting out of the water, which was totally covering this deck, sweeping all the seamen's trunks out of this part, which is called the forecastle. This part would be the galley. The cook got swept out of there. We know that it was the mate in the water, and we know all about it now. Well, but I still have questions. I still don't know what this thing here is, but I suspect, as I said before, that it was the sail to replace this one that they managed to get out of the sail locker. Here's the mate's name, Joseph Connors, 32 years old, of Boston. Previous ship, the Annie Troop. He got £8, 40 shillings a month. And he signed off in Baltimore. There's his signature, indicated that he received his wages. It's a fascinating portrait which posed many questions, most of which might never have been answered without the use of the crew lists, the insurance document, and the important discovery of the account in the New York Maritime Register. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the conclusion of this presentation on the Barque Mizpah and the man in the water.